Finlay Stanislaus Murchison, the tall, good-looking Highland Catholic from Lochalsh in Westeros, who abandoned his studies for the priesthood, emigrated to southern New Zealand, and spent decades encouraging his relations to follow him.
Finlay Murchison was born at Ardnarf, on the shores of Loch Carron, here in the Lochalsh region of Ross-shire in 1834. Now, Lochalsh had been cleared for sheep in 1812, and its people moved to small crofting settlements on the coast like Ardnarf. Finlay was the younger son of one such crofter's large family. His family were Catholic Highlanders, and when he was 13, Finlay entered the Scottish seminary here at St Mary's College in Blair's to train for the priesthood. He was to spend 8 years at Blair's, but recurrent ill health made for frequent breaks in his studies, and he finally left in 1856 without ever being ordained. With no apparent future for him back here in Lochalsh, he secured an assisted passage to Otago 3 years later, travelling on the Sevilla from Greenock in August 1859, along with his sister Catherine, who was pregnant but unmarried.
Also aboard were the McCormicks from Dumbarton, an extended family group of 8 who were likewise Scottish Catholics. This was unusual among Otago-bound Scots, but it is a reminder of the mainly Scottish character of the early Catholic Church in pioneer Otago.
On arrival, both the Murchisons and the McCormicks sought help and support from the Popplewell family at their farm Sunnock here near Milton, which was really the headquarters of Catholic activity in Otago at the time. Now you see, Finlay and his sister both came from the same district in Kintyre as Mrs. Popplewell, and they brought with them a letter of introduction to her. This was a common practice among new arrivals at that time, helping them get set up in a new area, and it was particularly important when they were members of a minority group. Irish Catholics found both a welcome and often initial employment here at Sunnock, but Finlay Murchison had his own special contribution to make to this embryonic Catholic community in Otago, and that was news that a priest back in his home parish in Scotland was prepared to come out to Otago if money could be found to support his mission. So a subscription was laid on, and in June 1860, negotiations began to bring Father James Lamont from Dorney in Kintail to become the first resident priest in Otago.
Father Lamont never actually came to New Zealand. After a long and frustrating sequence of letters back and forth between Otago and Scotland, he decided not to risk the journey south, and a few years later opted instead to head to Canada. Had he come, the history of Catholicism in the south might have been very different, bedding in the distinctively Scottish and French character that marked the church's early years in Otago, before the gold rushes of the 1860s brought an overwhelming influx of Irish Catholics.
Finlay and his sister had meanwhile moved to Riverton, where Catherine married Stephen Watson, an English storekeeper who had been a sailing agent there since 1840. Finlay spent several years farming in partnership with his brother-in-law up the river at Kintail, the Narrows. And he built this stone cottage for his sister with assistance from one of his nephews.
Later he went mustering and shearing in the Waio district. He was the first Pākehā to swim the Waio River about 5 kilometres below Lake Te Anau to show shearers the way to Manapōuri Station.
This was not the only example of Finlay Murchison acting as a wayfinder. Through the 1860s, he'd encouraged his brothers and a sister back in Kintyre to come on out to Otago. Then in the early 1870s, as the Vogel immigration schemes expanded the scale of New Zealand's assisted immigration considerably, Finlay approached the government directly to bring out large numbers of his relations.
His first list included some 60 to 70 names, and with support from Otago's provincial superintendent James McAndrew, this large group received special exemption from the regulations to expedite their migration. In the end, 40 of Finlay's relations from Ross-shire, Murchisons, McDonalds and McRaes, arrived on the Hydaspes from London at the end of 1872. Many others had not been able to afford the travel costs from the Highlands to the port of departure.
Those who did come included Finlay's older sister, the widow Mary McRae, who brought with her 4 sons, 3 daughters and a whisky still. She settled here in Hokanui, a district that was to become notorious for its large number of McRaes and even more so for their illicit distillation of whisky. Mary is remembered today here at the Hokanui Moonshine Museum in Gore as Kaliekan Island, the old lady of the island, the matriarch of New Zealand's most infamous whisky distilling district. The arrival of the Highlanders and the Hydaspes was not the end of Finlay's efforts to import the people of Lochalsh to southern New Zealand. In 1873, he again lobbied for a special immigration scheme from among his relations. Soon after, he began adding to the Scottish Catholic population of Southland more directly. In 1876, he married Anne MacDonald. The Murchisons settled here in the Waikaia district, where they began producing a large family of 5 sons and 3 daughters. Their sheep farm here near Ganeri Station was called Ardnaf, after Finlay's boyhood home on the shores of Loch Carron. Later, some of his sons began a famous gold mine high up the Waikaia River, where they also carried on in its difficult to access and isolated position the family tradition of distilling whisky. As an old pioneer, Finlay died in 1910, aged 75, but he didn't die of old age. Rather, he drowned accidentally in the sea near Invercargill while on a visit to some of those relations that he always remained so loyal to. His body washed up at Sandy Point, but regarded as something of a Highland patriarch, he was buried back here in Waikaia. Now today, we could consider Finlay the crucial link for so many southern families back to their own Highland roots in Scotland.